When we last left off in our lectures, before the break and everything occurred, we had been discussing philosophy of religion, and we had landed on a number of problems that emerge in the monotheistic conception of God. Right? Within monotheism, right, the traditional conception of God, at least within the Judaic-Christian worldview, is that he has 6 particular traits. Right? These traits being omnipotence, omniscience, omnibenevolence, being transcendent, and being eternal and infinite. Now, each one by itself is a rather odd, is rather puzzling in how we should conceive them. But it's really when we start looking at the interaction of the traits that we get to the Gordian knot that is that is God, right? And what it means philosophically and theologically for any number of other aspects, any number of other problems, right? One of the major problems, stemming especially within the Judaic-Christian framework, is the problem of predestination versus free will. Right? Now, this problem says that God uses these traditional traits of God to pose the following puzzle. Right? If God is all-knowing, right, then that means that he knows everything as though it were a fact. Right? Past, where we experience time linearly, God knows all possibilities and uh, therefore all eventualities. Right? He knows what we're going to do before we do it. Right? Because this is what it would mean for him to be all-knowing. It would mean that that to him the future is set in stone. This is the idea of God having an eschatological scheme to some degree. Right? Um, and if the future is set in stone from his perspective, then he already knows exactly what we're going to do. And if he knows what we're going to do, then how is it that we can claim to have free will? For if God knows what we're going to do before we do it, then we can't do otherwise. Because for us to do otherwise is for God to be wrong, which violates his omniscience. And for him to be right means that we don't have free will. We were already predestined to take a certain course of action. Now, if this is the case, then how is it that we can be punished, right? This was one of the problems, the last problem that we really touched on prior to the break. And it is a good, though theologically sort of laden way of transitioning into our next topic, which is the notion of free will itself. Right? Because this question of the problem of predestination versus free will has existed in various forms even long before Christian theology came along and it became problematized in the theological sense. Right. So, what we're going to be doing over the course of this series of lectures on for this week is examining the nature of free will. Right. So free will, to give us a working definition going forward, is the ability, given the same pre-existing conditions or circumstances, to make alternate choices. It's the classical, if I could go back and do it all over again, I'd change this, that, and the other thing. It's the ability to freely choose. Right? broadly speaking, right, there are three particular views about the nature of free will, because this question of free will is also a question of just how strict is the law of causality, right, of cause and effect, strict causality, right? How strictly does causation influence events in the world, right? Is everything that occurs a product of strict causation, meaning if A happens, then B necessarily follows, that we're have no choice, no freedom, and that's all an illusion? Or is strict causation only one form of causation that governs over action and events in the world? And if so, does this leave open the ability for freedom? Right? So these three possibilities uh, are hard determinism, which says that every event has a cause, and so no acts are free. Soft determinism, which says that events are caused, but at least some acts are free. For example, mental acts, the ability to think certain things. And then indeterminism, which says that not everything is dependent on prior causes, right? Um, and therefore we do have free will, like by necessity, since not everything physical is dependent on prior causes, strict causation. We do have free will. It should be noted that if determinism, specifically hard determinism, is right, the concepts of punishment and reward become empty terms, right? Because you can't do anything other than what you do. And this empties the very idea of moral responsibility, the ability to hold another person accountable for their actions because they could have chosen to do otherwise. It robs it of all its merit and strength and force. Right? So there are consequences for adhering to even strict determinism, or at least consequences on the metaphysical side. It might be that even if we do live in a deterministic world, we're still determined to act as though we could choose otherwise, right? And still wind up holding each other accountable, even though there's no real way to be morally accountable, right? Which raises its own set of epistemological questions that we're not going to touch on. Over the course of the following lectures, we will go through the ancient foundations in Western philosophy for determinism and this particular problem of free will. And we will examine in a certain degree of depth at four different philosophers and four different philosophies, um, variation with variations on these different answers to the question of, do we have free will? One for hard determinism, one for soft determinism, and one for each type of indeterminism.